Duck Break Time Act 2's The story opens with a chilling confession that sets the tone for the entire narrative. After more than 20 years of planning, I have committed a murder. On a cold, foggy night in London in 1854, Edward Glyver walks out into the shadows and kills a complete stranger. The victim didn't matter. The act was simply a test of willpower, a rehearsal for the true assassination Edward has been planning for decades. Edward is a man consumed by a singular, burning purpose. Through his journals, we discover that he is not a common criminal, but a highly educated scholar, a collector of rare books, and a man who believes he has been robbed of his rightful place in the world. Edward's life is a masterclass in deception. To his landlady and his few acquaintances, he is a quiet, reliable clerk. But at night, opium dens and dark alleys become his laboratory. The source of his madness is a man named Phoebus Daunt, a charismatic, brilliant, and utterly ruthless poet who has climbed to the highest peaks of London society. Phoebus is everything Edward is not: celebrated, wealthy, and beloved. But Edward harbors a secret that changes everything. He possesses evidence that Phoebus's fortune and status belong to him. The first act establishes a claustrophobic, gaslit London where every encounter is a calculated move in a deadly game of chess. The tension escalates as Edward takes a job at a prestigious law firm, using a false identity to gain access to historical documents. He is searching for a specific proof, a lost marriage certificate, that would validate his claim to the massive estate of Evenwood. The atmosphere is thick with Victorian dread. The ink on the old parchments feels like dried blood, and Edward's obsession borders on demonic possession. He watches Phoebus from afar, attending the same theater shows and high society gatherings, acting as an invisible phantom, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The first part concludes with a dangerous turn of events. Edward's nighttime activities attract the attention of the London underworld. He realizes that someone is watching him, mirroring his own movements. A mysterious woman from his past, Emily Carter, resurfaces, offering a connection to the innocence he lost long ago. But Edward cannot turn back. The test murder has been successful. He knows he has the capacity to kill without remorse. As the autumn fog rolls over the Thames, Edward closes his diary and prepares to enter the lion's den. The hunt for Phoebus Daunt has officially begun. To understand the depth of Edward's hatred, he takes us back to his youth at Eton and Cambridge, the places where his fate collided with Phoebus Daunt. In those days, Edward was known as Edward Glaptorn, a young man raised by a distant, secretive mother who refused to speak of his father. Despite his mysterious origins, Edward possessed a brilliant mind and a rare passion for books. It was at university that he met Phoebus, a dazzling, seductive force of nature, who effortlessly won the hearts of professors and students alike. Edward was drawn into Phoebus's orbit, believing they were brothers in intellect. He shared his deepest secrets with Phoebus, including a deathbed confession from his mother and a packet of old letters revealing that Edward was actually the legitimate son and sole heir of Lord Tanser. the master of Evenwood. This revelation was Edward's undoing. Instead of a loyal friend, Phoebus saw an opportunity to secure his own future. With a sociopathic precision, Phoebus systematically began to dismantle Edward's life. He stole the letters, forged documents to discredit Edward's character, and manipulated Lord Tancer into believing that Edward was an ungrateful impostor and a thief. Edward was expelled from university, his reputation ruined, and his financial support cut off overnight. While Edward sank into the crushing poverty of the London slums, Phoebus stepped into the vacuum, becoming Lord Tancer's favorite, his adopted prot, and the legal heir to the vast Evenwood fortune. The psychological torment of this act lies in Edward's realization of his own naivety. He didn't just lose a fortune, he lost his identity. Every time he looked in the mirror, he saw a ghost, a man who officially did not exist, while a monster lived his life, slept in his ancestral bed, and drank his wine. The narrative detail is exquisite, painting a grim picture of Edward's descent into depression and his subsequent resurrection through a singular, cold emotion: the desire for absolute ruin. He spent years studying the law, learning how to forge identities, and tracking Phoebus's rise to fame, waiting for the perfect moment when the fall would hurt the most. Act 2 reaches its peak when Edward discovers that Phoebus is planning the ultimate triumph. Lord Tancer is failing in health, and Phoebus is preparing to marry Lady Mary, a beautiful heiress whose family holds the final piece of land needed to consolidate the Evenwood Empire. If the wedding happens, Phoebus will be untouchable. Edward realizes that his time for passive observation is over. He must step out of the fog and insert himself directly into Phoebus's life. Part 2 ends with Edward using his stolen funds to buy a wardrobe fit for a gentleman and an invitation to a house party at Evenwood under a fabricated name. The shadow is ready to confront the sun. Edward arrives at Evenwood under the alias of a wealthy antiquarian book collector. Stepping onto the estate is a surreal experience. He is walking through the grand hallways, the manicured gardens, and the vast galleries that by right of blood belong to him. Lord Tancer, old and increasingly frail, welcomes this knowledgeable stranger who shares his passion for rare manuscripts. Edward spends his days in the estate's magnificent library, the very heart of the empire he was denied. But the real game begins when Phoebus Daunt arrives. Phoebus doesn't recognize his old victim in the mature, bearded gentleman, but he senses an underlying hostility, a chilling familiarity that he can't quite put his finger on. The tension in the third act is entirely psychological. Edward plays the part of the perfect guest while systematically poisoning Phoebus's reputation from within. He leaves anonymous notes for Lord Tancer, dropping subtle hints about Phoebus's secret debts, his gambling habits, and his midnight excursions to London's seediest districts. The estate becomes a chessboard where every dinner conversation is a duel. Edward watches with a dark satisfaction as the trust between the old lord and his chosen heir begins to fray. The atmosphere shifts from Victorian elegance to a Gothic nightmare of paranoia, where shadows seem to whisper secrets behind the velvet curtains. Amidst this campaign of ruin, Edward faces an unexpected complication: Lady Mary. The woman Phoebus is supposed to marry is not a pawn, but a deeply intelligent and perceptive person. As Edward spends time with her in the library, discussing poetry and history, a genuine, tragic connection forms between them. Lady Mary finds herself drawn to the melancholic scholar, while Edward realizes that by destroying Phoebus, he will inevitably break the heart of the only woman he has ever truly respected. His obsession with vengeance begins to clash with a newfound desire for a life he could actually live, a future away from the darkness. Act 3 culminates in a dramatic confrontation on the eve of the wedding announcement. Lord Tancer calls a family meeting in the study, his face pale with fury after discovering a forged document planted by Edward that implicates Phoebus in a massive financial fraud. Phoebus, backed into a corner, fiercely defends himself and suddenly turns his gaze onto Edward. The mask begins to slip. Phoebus realizes that this antiquarian has been the source of all his misfortunes. As the two enemies lock eyes across the room, the truth is on the verge of spilling out. Part 3 ends with a violent thunderstorm breaking over Evenwood, signaling that the time for psychological games is over. The final night has arrived. The storm outside Evenwood mirrors the violence that finally erupts within its walls. Exposed and desperate, Phoebus Daunt confronts Edward in the dark library, the truth of their identities finally laid bare. There are no more polite words or calculated moves. Phoebus, realizing his empire is collapsing, attacks Edward with a savage fury. But Edward has spent 20 years preparing for this exact moment. The struggle is brief, visceral, and lethal. In the shadow of the towering bookshelves, Edward delivers the fatal blow. Phoebus Daunt, the brilliant poet and thief of lives, dies on the floor of the library he tried to steal, his blood soaking into the ancient carpets. But the death of his rival does not bring the peace Edward anticipated. As he stands over the body, Lord Tancer enters the room, clutching a sealed letter. The old man, shocked by the violence, reveals the ultimate, crushing twist of the story. The letters Edward had found years ago were only half the truth. Lord Tancer reveals that he always knew Edward was his son, but he also reveals that Phoebus was his son as well, born from a secret, tragic affair. They were brothers. Lord Tancer had set up the entire rivalry as a brutal test to see which brother possessed the iron will required to rule Evenwood. By killing Phoebus, Edward didn't conquer the system. He merely completed his father's monstrous game. The emotional devastation is total. Lord Tancer dies of a broken heart hours later, leaving Edward as the sole, undisputed heir to Evenwood. Edward finally gets everything he ever wanted: the money, the title, the historical legacy, and the hand of Lady Mary. But the victory tastes like ash. Every luxury in the estate reminds him of the blood on his hands, and the brother he slaughtered. Lady Mary looks at him not with love, but with a growing, silent terror, as she begins to suspect the truth behind the tragedy. The meaning of night is finally clear to Edward. Vengeance is a hollow kingdom where the crown is made of cinders. The story concludes years later. Edward is an old man, trapped in his own magnificent palace, writing the final pages of the journal we have been reading. He has given away his fortune to charities and left Evenwood to rot, living as a ghost in the shadows of his own making. He realizes that the stranger he killed in the London fog in Part 1 was the moment he truly destroyed himself. As the fire dies out in his study and the night closes in, Edward Glyver puts down his pen. He is finally ready to join the brothers and fathers he destroyed, leaving behind a warning for anyone who believes that blood can ever wash away the past.